It started with a glance and ended with a silence I'll never escape. She called me brilliant. I called it forbidden. What happened in her office haunts everything. I used to admire her from across the room. Now I can't even meet her eyes. Not after what we did. Let's uncover what really happened. The fluorescent lights of the hallway hummed, a dull, oppressive sound that usually faded into the background of shuffling feet and locker slams. But today it felt like a drill boring straight into my skull. Every time I passed her classroom door, room 307, my stomach would perform this sickening little flip, a nauseous lurch that had nothing to do with the questionable cafeteria lunch. It was her, Ms. Albright. I couldn't look at her. Not directly. Not since her office. Even the words in my head felt scorched, forbidden. My gaze would skate past her, catching a blur of dark hair, the sharp line of her blazer, the way she held a book with those long, elegant fingers, and then I'd quickly find something incredibly fascinating about the fire extinguisher down the hall or the peeling paint on the opposite wall. It had been 3 days since that afternoon, 3 days of this agonizing charade, and the memory, instead of fading, seemed to etch itself deeper with every passing hour. It wasn't just a memory, it was a physical presence, a warmth that bloomed low in my belly, a tightening in my chest that made breathing feel like a conscious effort. Her office. The way the late afternoon sun had slanted through the dusty blinds, striping the small space in golden shadow. The scent of old books and her perfume, something subtle like sandalwood and maybe a hint of citrus, a scent I now found myself catching phantom whiffs of at the most inopportune moments. It had started so innocently, or at least that's what I told myself. Ms. Albright was new that semester, a mid-year replacement for old Mr. Henderson, who'd finally retired after threatening to do so for a decade. The moment she walked into our advanced literature class, a ripple had gone through the room. It wasn't just that she was younger than most of the teachers, maybe early 30s, with an intensity in her dark eyes that was both captivating and a little intimidating. It was the way she carried herself, a quiet confidence that filled the room without her ever raising her voice. She didn't try to be cool, didn't try to be our friend. She was simply present and utterly compelling. My fascination hadn't been immediate, not in a way I recognized as dangerous. At first, it was admiration. She spoke about poetry like it was a living thing, her voice a low, melodic cadence that could make even the densest sonnet feel urgent and alive. I'd find myself watching her mouth as she formed the words, the slight curve of her lips when a student offered a particularly insightful comment. I started staying a few minutes after class, ostensibly to ask about an assignment, but really just to be in her orbit a little longer, to catch another fragment of that focused attention. She had a way of looking at you, truly looking like she was dissecting your thoughts, but not in a critical way. More like she was genuinely curious about the mechanics of your mind. And when those dark eyes, almost black in certain lights, met mine, a strange current would pass between us. Or maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was just a teenager with an overactive imagination and a predisposition for inappropriate crushes. But it felt real. The air would crackle, just for a second. The way her fingers would sometimes brush mine when she handed back a paper, a fleeting contact that would leave my skin tingling for minutes afterward. The almost imperceptible pause before she'd answer one of my questions, as if she were considering not just the words, but the space between them, the space between us. I started to notice the small things. The way she'd tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the precise, almost severe way she organized her desk, the faint lines of concentration that would appear between her brows where she was deeply engrossed in a student's essay. I collected these details like precious secrets, hoarding them away. My grades, already good, Sword. I wanted to impress her, wanted her to see me as more than just another face in the crowd. And she did seem to notice. She'd call on me more often, her gaze lingering, a small, almost unreadable smile playing on her lips when I managed to articulate a complex idea. "That's an interesting perspective, Ilara," she'd say, her voice sending a shiver down my spine. "Ilara." She said my name like it was a poem itself. The other students became background noise. The classroom, The school, the entire world outside that bubble of focused intensity when she was speaking, it all just faded away. I lived for those 45-minute sessions, and then I'd spend hours replaying them in my head, dissecting every word, every glance, every fleeting moment of perceived connection. I told myself it was intellectual, a meeting of minds. But the heat that curled in my stomach when she leaned a little closer to point something out in my textbook, the way my breath would catch when her perfume drifted towards me, that wasn't intellectual. That was something else entirely, something primal and unsettling, something I was desperately trying to ignore, even as it consumed me. The weeks bled into months, and the unspoken tension, at least on my end, became a constant hum beneath the surface of my days. I started to dream about her, vivid, confusing dreams that left me waking with a racing heart and a deep, aching sense of longing. Nothing explicit ever happened in those dreams, not usually. It was more about the feeling, the proximity, the unbearable weight of something unsaid, something yearned for. One afternoon, I'd stayed late to work on a particularly challenging essay in the library. When I finally packed up, the school was mostly deserted. As I passed her classroom, I saw the light was still on, the door slightly ajar. I hesitated, a battle waging within me. Go home. Don't be weird. But my feet, as if with a will of their own, carried me to the doorway. I peeked in. She was at her desk, head bent over a pile of papers, a pen tucked behind her ear. The soft lamplight cast a warm glow on her face, softening the usual severity of her expression, making her look almost vulnerable. She hadn't noticed me, and in that unguarded moment, watching her, a wave of such intense longing washed over me that it almost buckled my knees. It was more than a crush. It was an ache, a hunger, and it terrified me. I must have made a sound, a small gasp, a shift of weight, because she looked up, her eyes meeting mine, wide and startled for a fraction of a second before her usual composure settled back in. "Alara," she said, her voice a little softer than usual. "I didn't hear you. Is everything all right?" My heart was hammering. "Yes, Ms. Albright. I was just leaving. I saw your light on." She nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "Just finishing up some grading. Long day." The silence stretched, thick and heavy. I should have just said good night and left. But I couldn't move. And then she did something that shifted everything, something that took that simmering tension and cranked it up to a boiling point. She gestured towards the chair opposite her desk. "Actually, since you're here, there was something in your last essay I wanted to discuss. If you have a moment." My mind screamed no, but my voice, betraying me, said, "Sure, I have a moment." And I walked into her classroom, into the lion's den, every nerve ending alight with a dangerous, thrilling awareness. That wasn't the day of the office incident, not yet, but it was a precursor, a tightening of the invisible string that seemed to connect us, pulling me closer, step by inexorable step, toward something I knew, deep down, I should be running from. The memory of that particular late afternoon discussion, sitting across from her in the otherwise empty classroom, felt like a turning point. The moment the subtle undercurrent between us became something more palpable, something I could no longer dismiss as mere admiration or teenage fantasy. She hadn't talked about my essay right away. Instead, she'd leaned back in her chair, the old wood creaking softly, and studied me for a long moment, her dark eyes searching, as if she were trying to read something hidden beneath the surface. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, not exactly, but it was charged, filled with an unspoken weight that made the air in the room feel thick and heavy. "You're a very perceptive writer, Alara," she finally said, her voice low and smooth, like velvet. "You see things, connections, that most students your age miss." My cheeks warmed at the praise, but it was more than just validation I felt. It was the intensity of her gaze, the way she seemed to be looking right into me, that made my pulse quicken. "Thank you." I managed, my voice a little breathier than I intended. I find material really engaging." She smiled, a small, knowing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes but sent a jolt through me nonetheless. "It's more than that, I think. There's a certain intensity to your analysis, a willingness to delve into the uncomfortable, the ambiguous. She paused, her gaze dropping to the papers on her desk for a moment before returning to mine. It's a rare quality. We talked for a while then, not just about literature, but about ideas, about the way stories shape our understanding of the world, of ourselves. It was the kind of conversation I'd always craved, the kind I rarely found with my peers. With her, it felt effortless, like our minds were working on the same wavelength. But beneath the intellectual sparring, there was something else, a subtle dance of awareness. The way her knee would occasionally brush against the side of the desk, sending a vibration through the wood that I felt resonate deep in my bones. The way her scent, that intoxicating mix of sandalwood and something crisp and clean, seemed to permeate the small space, wrapping around me like an invisible embrace. I found myself hyper-aware of her every movement, the slight tilt of her head when she was listening, the way her fingers would tap lightly on the desk when she was forming a thought, the almost imperceptible intake of her breath before she spoke. And I knew, with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying, that she was just as aware of me. There were moments when our eyes would lock, and the world would seem to stop, the air crackling with an unspoken energy. In those moments, the age difference, the teacher-student dynamic, all of it would fade away, leaving just the two of us, two people connected by an undeniable and increasingly dangerous pull. As the light outside began to fade, casting long shadows across the classroom floor, she finally picked up my essay. "About this section here," she said, her voice pulling me back from the brink of whatever trance I'd fallen into. She leaned forward, pointing to a paragraph, and her arm brushed against mine. It was the briefest of touches, skin against skin, but it sent a shock wave through my system. My breath hitched, and I could feel the heat rising in my face. She didn't pull away immediately. For a fraction of a second, her arm lingered, the warmth of her skin seeping into mine. And when she finally did move, her eyes met mine, and there was a flicker of something in their depths, something knowing, something that mirrored the turmoil I felt inside. We finished discussing the essay, but the rest of the conversation was a blur. My mind was consumed by that touch, by the heat it had ignited, by the undeniable evidence that this wasn't just in my head. When I finally stood up to leave, my legs felt unsteady. "Thank you, Ms. Albright," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "That was really helpful." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "You're welcome, Elara. Don't hesitate to stop by if you have more questions." The unspoken invitation hung in the air between us, heavy with possibility. As I walked out of the classroom and into the dim, empty hallway, I felt like I was walking on air, my body buzzing with a strange, exhilarating energy. The encounter had been nothing and everything all at once. No lines had been crossed, not overtly, but something had shifted, a silent acknowledgement of the current that flowed between us. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was only a matter of time before that current became too strong to resist. The office incident, as I'd come to call it in the privacy of my own turbulent thoughts, happened a week later. It wasn't planned, not by me anyway, and I doubt by her either, though looking back, the path to it seemed almost preordained, each small moment of connection, each charged glance, leading us inevitably towards that cramped, sun-dusted room. It was a Thursday. I had a free period last, and I decided to use the time to ask Ms. Albright for some clarification on the upcoming term paper. The topic was complex, dealing with themes of transgression and societal boundaries in literature, and ironically, it felt like the perfect metaphor for the unspoken turmoil brewing inside me. I found her in her classroom, but she was packing up, a worn leather satchel open on her desk. "Oh, Elara," she said, a slight frown creasing her brow when she saw me. "I was just about to head to a department meeting. Can it wait until tomorrow?" My heart sank a little. I've been psyching myself up for this interaction all day, a ridiculous amount of mental energy expended on what was on the surface a simple academic query. "Oh, sure," I stammered, feeling foolish. "It's not urgent." I just had a couple of quick questions about the essay prompt. She paused, her hand hovering over her satchel. She looked at her watch, then back at me, and I saw that familiar flicker in her eyes, the one that always made my breath catch. "Tell you what," she said, a decision seeming to form. "Walk with me. My office is on the way to the meeting room. We can chat for a few minutes there. It's quieter than the hallway." My stomach did that little flip again. Her office. I'd never been in her actual office before, just the classroom. The prospect felt both exciting and intensely nerve-wracking. "Okay," I agreed, trying to sound casual, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. We walked together down the corridor, the silence between us less about awkwardness and more about a tightly coiled anticipation. I was acutely aware of her beside me, the subtle sway of her movements, the way the fabric of her skirt brushed against her legs. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, my mind racing, rehearsing my questions, tried to appear calm and collected, while inside, a storm was brewing. Her office was small, smaller than I expected, tucked away in a quieter part of the school. Bookshelves lined one wall, crammed with texts that ranged from ancient philosophy to contemporary poetry. A single window looked out onto the overgrown back quad, the glass slightly grimy. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and that faint, intoxicating perfume of hers. It felt intensely personal, a stark contrast to the impersonal space of the classroom. She didn't sit behind her desk. Instead, she leaned against the edge of it, crossing her arms, creating an even more intimate and formal atmosphere. "So," she said, her voice a little softer in the confined space. "Your questions about the essay?" I launched into them, trying to focus on the academic, on the words, on anything but the fact that we were alone in this small, quiet room, the door closed behind us. I talked about the nuance of the prompt, about the authors I was considering, and she listened, nodding occasionally, her gaze fixed on me with that unnerving intensity. As I spoke, I found myself gesturing more than usual, my hands moving to emphasize points, a nervous energy thrumming through me. At one point, I stumbled over a word, my mind momentarily blanking, and a flush crept up my neck. She didn't comment, just waited patiently, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. "It's about the nature of forbidden knowledge, isn't it?" she mused when I finally paused. "The allure of what lies beyond the accepted boundaries." Her eyes held mine, and the academic discussion suddenly felt very, very personal. "What do you think, Alara? Why are we so drawn to stories of transgression?" My mouth felt dry. "Maybe," I began, my voice a little hoarse, "maybe it's because we all have parts of ourselves that feel forbidden, desires or thoughts that don't fit within the lines." My gaze flickered down to her hands, then back to her eyes. And seeing those explored, even in fiction, makes us feel less alone, or perhaps it gives us a kind of permission to acknowledge them in ourselves. She didn't speak for a long moment, the silence stretching, taut and fragile. The sunlight through the window had shifted, casting longer, deeper shadows. I could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere, the distant shouts of students on the sports field. But in that room, it felt like time had stopped. "That's a very insightful way to put it," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. She pushed herself off the desk and took a step closer, then another. The space between us shrank until I could feel the warmth radiating from her body, until her perfume was an almost dizzying presence. My heart was hammering against my ribs, so hard I was sure she could hear it. I couldn't breathe properly. I couldn't think. All I could do was look at her, at the intensity in her eyes, at the slight parting of her lips. "And what," she continued, her voice dropping even lower, a husky tremor in it that sent shivers down my spine, "what forbidden things are you drawn to, Alara?" My mind was a blank canvas, wiped clean by the sheer force of her proximity, by the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. Her eyes, those dark, fathomless pools, searched mine, and I felt stripped bare, every hidden longing, every secret desire, exposed under her unwavering gaze. I tried to form words, to offer some intelligent, detached response, but my throat had closed up. All I could manage was a shaky breath, my gaze locked with hers. The air in the small office crackled, thick with an electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. She was so close now. I could see the faint, almost invisible lines around her eyes, the subtle pulse beating at the base of her throat. Her scent enveloped me, sandalwood and something uniquely her, a fragrance that was rapidly becoming my undoing. She didn't press for an answer to her question. Perhaps she didn't need one. Perhaps she could read it in my wide, dilated pupils, in the tremor that ran through me, in the way my lips had parted slightly, unconsciously. Her own gaze dropped, just for a fraction of a second, to my mouth, and then flickered back up to my eyes. That tiny movement, that infinitesimal shift of focus, was like a spark to dry tinder. A wave of heat washed over me, pooling low in my stomach, making my knees feel weak. I knew, with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty, that we were standing on the edge of a precipice. One wrong move, one unspoken word given voice, and we would fall. And a part of me, a reckless, desperate part, wanted to jump. She raised a hand, slowly, as if moving through water. I watched, mesmerized, as her fingers came towards my face. My breath hitched. I thought she was going to touch my cheek, a gesture that would have been earth-shattering in its implications. But instead, her fingers paused, hovering inches from my skin. "Elara," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the charged silence. "This is we shouldn't." Her words were a protest, a boundary, but her eyes told a different story. They were filled with a raw, conflicted hunger that mirrored my own. And her hand, though it hadn't touched me, was still there, suspended between us, a silent testament to the battle raging within her. I know, I managed to breathe out, the words barely audible. And in that moment, some invisible dam inside me broke. The fear, the restraint, the carefully constructed walls I had built around this impossible desire, they all crumbled. I leaned forward, closing the small gap that remained between us. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was an instinct, a primal pull too strong to resist. My lips brushed against hers. It was the softest of contacts, a feather-light touch, yet it sent an explosion of sensation through my entire body. Her lips were warm, surprisingly soft. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved, suspended in that electrifying moment of first contact. Then I felt her breath catch a sharp intake of air, and her hand, the one that had been hovering, finally moved. Her fingers threaded into my hair, cupping the back of my head, and she tilted my face up to hers. And then she kissed me. Not tentatively, not hesitantly, but with a sudden, desperate intensity that stole the air from my lungs. It was a kiss of unspoken longing, of suppressed desire, finally unleashed. Her mouth was firm, demanding, yet incredibly tender. Her other arm snaked around my waist, pulling me flush against her, and I could feel the lean strength of her body, the rapid beat of her heart against mine. I melted into her, my own arms finding their way around her neck, my fingers tangling in the silky strands of her hair. The world outside that small office, the school, the rules, the consequences, all of it ceased to exist. There was only the heat, the pressure, the intoxicating taste of her, the feeling of her body pressed against mine. It was everything I had fantasized about, and yet it was so much more real, so much more overwhelming than anything my imagination could have conjured. Her tongue met mine, a slow, deliberate exploration that sent shivers of pleasure coursing through me. A soft moan escaped my lips, muffled against hers. She responded with a deeper kiss, a low groan rumbling in her chest. It was messy and raw and utterly consuming. Time seemed to stretch and warp. I had no idea how long we stood there, locked in that embrace, lost in the intensity of the moment. It could have been seconds. It could have been an eternity. All I knew was that I never wanted it to end. The rational part of my brain, the small, panicked voice that had been screaming warnings for weeks, was completely silent now, drowned out by the overwhelming tide of sensation and emotion. This was wrong, so profoundly wrong on so many levels, and yet, in that moment, nothing had ever felt more right. The sunlight filtering through the blinds had shifted again, painting stripes of fading gold across the floor, across our entwined bodies. The distant sounds of the school day ending, a bell ringing, the rumble of a bus, the faint shouts of students, began to penetrate the cocoon of our embrace, a harsh reminder of the world we had momentarily forgotten. Slowly, reluctantly, the kiss began to soften, the urgency ebbing, replaced by a lingering tenderness. She pulled back, just enough to look at me, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes dark and luminous, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. Her lips were swollen, her hair slightly disheveled. She looked undone and beautiful. My own heart was pounding a wild rhythm against my ribs. I felt dazed, my body thrumming with a potent cocktail of adrenaline and desire. We just stared at each other for a long moment, the silence in the room now heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the forbidden intimacy that now hung between us like a tangible thing. It was Ms. Albright who finally broke the spell, though her voice when she spoke was barely a whisper, rough and unsteady. "Alara," she breathed, her thumb gently tracing the line of my jaw, sending a fresh wave of shivers through me. This can't happen." The words were like a splash of icy water, a brutal return to reality. The warmth that had enveloped me moments before began to recede, replaced by a chilling awareness of the enormity of what we had done. Guilt, sharp and sudden, pierced through the haze of desire. Fear, cold and clenching, began to uncoil in my stomach. She was right. This couldn't happen. It was reckless, dangerous, and the potential consequences were terrifying to contemplate. Her career, my future, everything could be jeopardized by this one moment of madness. Her hand dropped from my face, and she took a small step back, creating a chasm between us that felt miles wide. The intensity in her eyes was still